you said, and also is going to be a very crucial contribution to all of our four betters in our new strategic framework of FAO. Thank you very much for your words, Director General. En este momento tengo el placer de...
It is now an honor for me to introduce Her Excellency Teresa Ribera Rodríguez, Deputy Prime Minister of Spain, who unfortunately could not join us in person. However, she sent through a statement, which we will listen to now. You have the floor, Deputy Prime Minister of Spain. I'd like to thank our sister country for its commitment to forging a transparent agenda for biodiversity, for combating climate change, for involving society at large, for its multilateral commitment, which is a determining factor for its people and the planet at large. The backdrop to all this is quite peculiar, as we see existing vulnerability among Indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities, compounded by the impact of biodiversity loss, land use changes, inadequately preserved forests, and, of course, climate change. The latter disproportionately affects the most vulnerable people, in particular groups which had very little to do with causing this phenomenon. This situation will be exacerbated by the loss of forest land. At the same time, forest land will diminish as a result of increasingly serious forest fires and hazards that stem from climate change-related effects. Problems such as the loss of groundwater in tropical forests, the potential for unseasonably high temperatures, protracted and harsher droughts, lead to concerns over the emergence of new disease pathways. There are also concerns over the risk that new pests will come to threaten our biodiversity. Indigenous women bear the brunt of lost opportunities, opportunities which were already few and far between, despite the fact that they are already struggling with scant supplies and water scarcity. They are affected to a larger degree than men, which is why they are most at risk, despite, as I said, bearing very little responsibility for the problem. We must seek to profoundly contribute to solutions. Our experience, as well as a forward-looking analysis of the impact of resilience building and adaptation capacity, are key. We should all join the fight against climate change. That is why the momentum created by the United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues and the establishment of the Platform for Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples in 2015 at COP21 in Paris should be seized as a good opportunity for the exchange of experiences and joint efforts to enhance not only our understanding of the problem per se, but also its visibility vis-à-vis the international community and the generation of targeted responses across the board. The Paris Agreement acknowledges that states should respect, promote, and consider Indigenous peoples' rights when taking measures to combat climate change. Indigenous peoples' involvement needs to be real, and it has been, notwithstanding difficult circumstances in Madrid during COP25. Now, as we face the challenge of injecting new life into the process, as we strive to uphold the goal of keeping the temperature rise to a maximum of 1.5 degrees, in the run-up to the Glasgow conference at the end of the year, we need to channel our enthusiasm and energy toward this goal. That is why we need to forge a mitigation and adaptation-oriented approach which factors in Indigenous peoples' rights and their specificities. We need to develop tools and methods with which to examine the impact of our initiatives on the vulnerability of these groups. We must recognize the contribution of traditional knowledge in providing innovative responses to the challenges we face in achieving progress and development within our communities. We need to build adequate capacity in the domains of resilience and adaptation to extreme weather events. We must establish strategies and methods for disaster risk reduction. We need prevention and early warning tools. Given all of the above, I'd once again like to acknowledge the role, the unflagging, deeply committed role that the government of Costa Rica has played in taking into account all of these factors in its nationally determined contributions. I'd also like to pay tribute to the leadership of Environment Minister Andrea Meja and Costa Rica's Foreign Minister in responsibly and intelligently addressing the key issues I've described, and in particular efforts pertaining to communication, dialogue, and the empowerment of these groups. This reflects a fundamental notion, especially given the current context, that of climate justice. Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister of Spain, for reminding us all that our commitment to the planet must involve indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities. With the leaving no one behind approach, but should also take into account the fact that they are key actors if we are to build an equitable world where we can put pay to climate change. Thank you once again. It's now an honor for me to give the floor to Her Excellency Epsy Campbell Barr, the first Vice President of Costa Rica. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias y muy buena y muy.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I would like to greet the FAO Director General, Dr. Dongyu, as well as Cardinal Peter Turkson, the Prefect for the Dicastery for promoting integral human development of the Holy See. I'd also like to greet the Vice President of Uruguay, who's truly committed and has been and continues to be a part of this process. It's a great opportunity to have Alexis Newberg here with us representing Afro-descendant communities in Europe, and I'd like to specifically thank Rene Castro of FAO and the Ambassador of Costa Rica to the Vatican for all the efforts you have made to ensure that we could all meet here today. The first thing I'd like to say is that there's no other way to mitigate the impact of climate change than to continue to strengthen strategic partnerships among those of us who are in a position to make decisions and the actors and stakeholders within communities. We need to link international organizations, governments, and communities. This is a key element, and this becomes clear when we talk about indigenous communities, Afro-descendant communities, and migrants. Not only due to climate change, but also due to the historic debt of our countries, they are at a clear disadvantage. The Deputy Prime Minister of Spain mentioned the fact that they are paying the bill for problems they're not responsible for. We have 8 different indigenous peoples in our country, recognized indigenous peoples, many significant initiatives such as the Decarbonization National Plan. We also have a solid, very recent plan for the future to increase our country's forest cover by from 52 to 60%, sowing 400,000 hectares. This program targets the northern part of the country, given that there is a high volume of migrants in that part of the country. Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples need to be taken into consideration when forging plans to tackle climate change. We need to ensure that we guarantee not only basic living conditions, but also nature-based solutions. There is no way that we can provide these groups and peoples with sufficient living standards if we do not change our mindset when it comes to the development we've achieved so far. Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant and tribal territories that provide governance services need to be formally recognized as our other territories. To date, these groups continue to face countless challenges when it comes to directly benefiting from financial resources channeled toward climate change. There's a pyramid of resources. There's significant investment. There is a great deal of commitment on the part of some governments, but at the end of the day, neither financial nor technical resources nor the recognition of ancestral knowledge are part of structural initiatives, not in the way they should be. We therefore need to enhance our country's experience. This is an experience that we can seek to drive. FAO is a strategic partner. We have a program for environmental services that compensate these essential groups. In Costa Rica, we do have a little bit of experience, but this needs to be scaled up to the regional level. We need to foster programs that seek to curb deforestation and tap into forestry potential in given areas. There are very positive examples in Guatemala, Mexico, and Costa Rica where communities are compensated for carrying out forestry-related activities that are sustainable. Productive reforestation is one of the key elements that I would like us to focus on. If we look at the millions of hectares that we have where indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities live, well, we have a global strategy and one for Latin America and the Caribbean, which we should have a strategy which allows us to pay for specific programs by hectare. This would give us the opportunity to make progress. We're currently only paying $3 per hectare, Mexico $30, Costa Rica some $60, Guatemala $100. If we wish to achieve forest sustainability, we need to be really ambitious with very targeted programs. I must say that these programs need to have a gender-based approach. Women must be factored in as key players. If we allow communities to access financial resources so that they can preserve forest resources, so that they can achieve sustainability and mitigate climate change, then women need to be at the core of this. Afro-descendant communities, which account for the diaspora in this region and account for 200,000 people, 130 million rather, according to official statistics, have significant ancestral knowledge. I'd like to address the continent at large here, the continent and the Caribbean. I'd also like to say that the possibility to forge strategic partnerships, such as those we are forging with the Vatican and others, and here again I'd like to mention Cardinal Turkson, is key. We need to strengthen these partnerships. I would like to propose, and I'm addressing Cardinal Turkson as well as the ambassador and FAO, that we conduct partnership work with Afro-descendant communities in a meeting with the Pope and the highest authorities of FAO to establish a mitigation strategy for climate change within Afro-descendant communities and rural communities in our region. this strategic partnership needs to be consolidated so that we can take a great leap forward in learning from the best practices out there, to learn from these communities' know-how, to strengthen women's leadership further. We already have a regional partnership in this realm, which, well, we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Global Conference Against Racism on the 31st of August. I would like for Alexis to come to Costa Rica for this, because on that date we will be celebrating the International Day of Afro-descendant communities in the world. This initiative was approved by the UN General Assembly as proposed by my country in December last year. Environmental issues, climate change related issues, the concrete commitment we have to Indigenous communities, and I know Myrna Cunningham is here. Others have also played a key role in developing Indigenous communities. If we look to tackle the challenges we face, not only to achieve impact, but also to provide targeted answers, then we will make headway. I'd like to conclude in acknowledging and applauding the role of Indigenous and Afro-descendant women in enhancing productive and organizational work, the role they play in forging, strengthening or initiatives to strengthen the measures we take. I fully believe that through this partnership we are forging, this partnership which is recognized by FAO because it also has to do with developing the food security of these communities. It takes into account the role of the Vatican, international organizations, and states. We will truly make progress. Once again, I'd like to acknowledge FAO's efforts and the fundamental role it has played in recognizing traditional roles and goods, as well as the sustainable management of natural biodiversity, both land and water-based. We have an opportunity to use these fora, women's leadership at the international level, to make qualitative progress, not only in mitigating climate change, but also doing forward-looking work toward guaranteeing a better quality of life and a sustainable economic growth agenda and nature-based solutions, and guaranteeing that no one, no migrant, no woman, no Afro-descendant individual is left behind. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vice President. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you very much for highlighting the importance of strategic partnerships. Here at FAO, it's a real honor to have the opportunity to be one of Costa Rica's strategic partners, given that it has played a leading role in compensation for environmental services involving women and leaders in the country. Thank you once again for all your efforts to stressing the role of Afro-descendant communities and women.
I would have welcomed Cardinal Peter Turkson to be part of this opening panel. But I understand that the Cardinal, who, as we know, is the Prefect of the Dicastery for promoting integral human development of the Vatican City, he's a little bit delayed, and he will be joining us in a moment. So I'd like to now give the floor to Jean-Léonard, who will introduce our keynote speaker, and then, of course, give the floor to Cardinal Turkson when he will be joining us. Jean-Léonard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marcela, for giving me the floor. I'm very happy to participate to this meeting, and I would like right now to present a very important personality, Anne Noirgam Chair, UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, for her keynote speaker. You have the floor.
Gito, thank you. Distinguished dignitaries from Costa Rica, Spain, the Holy See, Uruguay, and Jamaica, FAO Director General Dr. Dongyu, speakers and representatives of Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants and migrants. Indigenous brothers and sisters, good afternoon. I'm very honored to have an excellent opportunity to address all of you in my capacity as a Sami woman and the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to talk about the impacts of climate change. Before introducing my remarks, please allow me to congratulate FAO, Costa Rica, the Holy See, and Spain for taking the initiative to convene here today to discuss a paramount issue, climate change. This phenomenon particularly affects Indigenous and Afro-descendant women. I echo the words of the opening remarks celebrating the 5 years of the encyclical letter Laudato Si. We appreciate the statements of His Holiness Pope Francis supporting our rights to self-determination and collective rights. I have repeated the following statement countless times, but I believe that it is never enough to emphasize that the Indigenous peoples are not vulnerable. Indeed, we face hunger, poverty, malnutrition, and other challenges. But we have preserved food and knowledge systems for centuries. The problem is that more and more we see our rights threatened, more and more our leaders are being killed, more and more we are losing our lands and territories, and in Sami case also our right to waters. We are being placed by outsiders, ill policies, and short-sighted programs into situations of vulnerability. But I repeat, we are not vulnerable. I want to highlight that today's event is about the impacts of climate change on 3 apparently different populations, without mentioning that many migrants might be Indigenous persons and also Afro-descendants. Nevertheless, one particular aspect that unites us all is the land. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is putting at risk the physical and cultural survival of Indigenous peoples worldwide due to our direct dependence and close relationship with the land, territories, and resources. Evidence shows that in my region, in the Arctic, climate change is more exacerbated and accelerated than in any other region. Warming temperatures, uncertainty about seasons, and unexpected winds have challenged the availability of fishing and hunting food species, and not to mention about the change of the nature of ice that getting more vulnerable. Notably, for my people, the Sami reindeer herders and fishers, increased unpredictability and frequency of extreme weather events are disrupting human-animal agency. Furthermore, amongst the most threatened peoples are the Indigenous peoples from islands because of the rising sea levels. In the Amazon region, warming temperatures, more frequent extreme weather, and deforestation have threatened the availability and stability of the local food resources. Consequently, climate change is increasing migration and forced relocation of Indigenous peoples. We also witness that Indigenous peoples are forced to migrate away from their traditional lands, often face double discrimination as both migrants and as indigenous peoples. In this context, indigenous peoples may be more vulnerable to irregular migration, such as trafficking and smuggling, due to forced displacement, limited legal migration options, and limited opportunities to make informed choices. Deforestation, particularly in developing countries, is pushing indigenous families to migrate to cities for economic reasons. Paradoxically, despite contributing the least to greenhouse gas emissions, indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected by environmental changes. What struck me most is that we indigenous peoples occupy only 25% of the global surface, and within that portion, we managed to protect 80% of the remaining biodiversity. We speak 4,000 out of 6,700 languages. Think about the amount of and significant knowledge we carry throughout our languages. I think the data speaks for itself. However, the lack of recognition of such an endeavor does not honor our contributions to the humankind and biodiversity protection. In fact, there are many contradictions that are putting us at the edge of our capacities. For instance, indigenous peoples represent 18.7% of the world's extreme poor. I want to draw attention from all of you, emphasizing that indigenous peoples continue facing many challenges. Some indigenous peoples are not recognized as peoples legally, and their collective rights are not respected. Land tenure security and the pressure over natural resources are increasing due to the extractive industries, agriculture, logging, as well as lack of respect for their right to free, prior, and informed consent, and lack of engagement in decision-making processes and policy discussions, among others. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated existing inequities in indigenous peoples' food systems, health, and territorial rights due to discrimination and marginalization. Similarly, we came to acknowledge a large number of laws have been adapted to detriment of the rights of indigenous peoples. We are facing a reverse in terms of rights recognition. In this respect, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, a subsidiary body of the UN Economic and Social Council, has highlighted that the climate change exacerbates the difficulties already faced by indigenous peoples, including political and economic marginalization, loss of lands and resources, human rights violations, discrimination, and unemployment. Particularly, the recent 20th session of the UN Permanent Forum, held in April in New York, focused on SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. The alarming increasing rates of criminalization, violence, and attacks against indigenous peoples were at the center of the discussion. This is an issue that governments, parliaments, and international organizations must take action. It is unacceptable that indigenous peoples are killed for defending our rights, our lands, and our peoples. We indigenous peoples play a critical role in combating climate change through our knowledge and practices that are valuable to inform sustainability, science, resilience building strategies, and adaptation to climate changes. Issues that are increasingly recognized by states however, despite this recognition, indigenous peoples' views, cosmovisions, and time-tested practices continue to be excluded from science and policy. At this point, my arguments have mainly focused on challenges, but now I would like to shift to the opportunities. Amid these difficult times, there are great news, ladies and gentlemen. We indigenous peoples have not waited for external responses to tackle climate change. In many parts of the world, indigenous peoples are leading efforts to assess climate change impacts and plan adaptation actions. The UN Permanent Forum, during its annual session, as well as expert group meetings, have highlighted important initiatives undertaken by indigenous peoples themselves, and in some cases with the support of member states and other actors. For instance, in Bangladesh, villagers are creating floating vegetable gardens to protect their livelihoods from flooding. Indigenous peoples in Central, South American and Caribbean regions are shifting their agricultural activities and settlements to new locations that are susceptible to adverse climate conditions. In North America, some indigenous groups strive to cope with climate change by focusing on economic opportunities, such as renewable energy using wind and solar power. In the case of UN entities, FAO contributed greatly with the establishment of the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems, with indigenous peoples themselves and researchers drafting the white or Wipala paper on indigenous peoples' food systems. Jon Fernández Larinoa already mentioned this significant endeavor. I'd like to thank the Global Hub, the several indigenous peoples, researchers, and the FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit for the hard work done to put together a scientific document like this one through a participatory process of indigenous peoples in record time. When the Global Hub of Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems was endorsed last September, we agreed that the Global Hub's primary function would be to develop collaborative processes of acknowledge co-generation with indigenous leaders and organizations and scientific researchers to inform the global debate on sustainable food systems and climate change. And this is exactly what the White Wipala paper represents. We indigenous peoples want to highlight that our food systems functioning for centuries can inform how to be resilient, how to adapt to climate change, and generate food without depleting their natural resource base despite the challenges. We indigenous peoples are agents of change. We are not vulnerable population waiting for support. We are organized peoples with authorities and institutions that represent us. And we do not need others to speak on our behalf. And this is what the UN enhanced participation process is all about. We request governments, policymakers, international organizations, and specifically in the frame of the UN Food System Summit to be involved in the dialogues and decision-making processes. We will speak for ourselves. In this respect, we requested the UN Food System Summit and all UN agencies and the scientific community to recognize indigenous peoples' food systems and the body of indigenous peoples' knowledge that informs them. And to conclude, I would like to uphold that the recognition of indigenous peoples' traditional resilience mechanisms and coping strategies in response to mitigating climate change in global and local policies is fundamental. Additionally, indigenous land tenure and sovereignty are prerequisites to adaptive capacity in confronting climate change and addressing global sustainability. I will elaborate more on this in the closing remarks. Indigenous peoples expect pertinent, significant, and effective actions after this high-level expert, not only to address climate change, but also to generate the conditions for indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant populations, and migrants to fully exercise our rights. Thank you. Kiitos.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Anne Morgan, Chair of the UN Permanent Forum on indigenous issues. Thank you for your keynote speakings. I was personally impressed by the fact that you stressed that the indigenous people are not recognized as persons and their collective rights are not respected. This is something we should keep in mind when talking about inclusivity, when talking about democracy and inclusion. And thank you for giving us a lot of information, a lot of very helpful and useful input. And thank you for stressing not only challenges, but even opportunity. I like very much when you said, we indigenous people, we have urgent of change. Thank you very much. Now we will move to the first panel of discussion. Very closely bind to the keynote speaker we have right now listened. It's about climate change posing challenges on livelihoods, biodiversity, and traditional knowledge over indigenous people, Afro-descendant populations, and Latin American migrants. We have very rich panelists and important panelists. I would like to thank one by one these panelists who accepted to be part of this panel of discussion. First of all, it's my pleasure to introduce for her speech Myrna Cunningham, President of Fund for the Development of Indigenous People of Latin America and the Caribbean. I would like to remember to the panelists that you have 7 minutes for your presentation. Myrna Cunningham, the floor is yours, and I'm very pleased to listen to you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening. I'd like to greet you from the Miskito people in Nicaragua, a people which was affected in November 2020 for 15 days by 2 hurricanes that were extremely powerful, causing huge losses among the countries of the region, but especially affecting the indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples. Thousands of people in some of the countries had to leave because of the poor response which was provided for them to be able to continue living properly. And it is therefore essential for voices, rights and solutions from the indigenous peoples to be given pride of place in debates such as today's, because any discussion related to the climate crisis requires the vision of the indigenous peoples. Day on day, we see the effects of this crisis on territories and resources of our peoples. Reference has already been made to forest fires in Brazil, Australia, Siberia, and the droughts and flooding which have devastated the ecosystems of indigenous peoples. And we believe that we cannot talk about these issues without full and effective participation of ourselves, including women, men, elders, and those youngsters as well who are deeply involved. Notwithstanding the disproportionate effects, we continue being leaders in experience in terms of adaptation, mitigation, and resilience in our lands. If we list the 2 main threats to our peoples, on the one hand, one has the extractivist economic model, and on the other hand, the climate change impact. These 2 processes are the ones which affect and force our peoples to leave. But we know that within states, in many countries, indigenous peoples are not even still recognized yet formally, and their lands and territories and resources are not recognized either or respected. It's common to see indigenous peoples facing manifold obstacles if they are to take part in the formal economy and have access to justice and be part and parcel of the political and decision-making processes. If we think about solutions, recently we jointly published with the FAO a study demonstrating that the places of the indigenous peoples controlled by those peoples are dealing with less deforestation. They're better able to protect their resources and their biodiversity. Therefore, if we think in terms of solutions in this document, we would refer to 5 of them. Firstly, ensuring land tenure for the indigenous peoples, collective tenure, that is. Secondly, strengthening the territorial governance systems. Thirdly, payment for the environmental services, which is something which the Vice President of Costa Rica referred to. Fourthly, supporting forestry management processes for indigenous peoples with community measures and community tourism. And fifthly, recognizing traditional knowledge in our peoples, which is obviously related to the food systems of our peoples. And we've said that in order to bring about these changes, we need to change the way in which we address and work with institutions which are governed or led by indigenous people, so that everything we do may contribute to free self-determination of indigenous peoples. We've already appealed to the next COP for a fund to be earmarked and to be directly managed by indigenous peoples for the promotion of our adaptation measures and for the strengthening of our knowledge and livelihoods in our territories. We know that important strides have been made with the Green Fund and with JEF and so on. Nonetheless, very little of these resources directly reach the indigenous peoples. That is why we make this appeal for this dedicated fund. Furthermore, we restate the points made by the Secretary General in 2019 to the effect that there's a need to implement holistic plans to protect cultural diversity and to develop activities related to climate change which ensure and uphold the right to our lands, territories and resources, and the issue of informed, free prior consent for any measure affecting our territories, as well as implementing and promoting a human rights approach regarding access to renewable energy, so that there is a fair, just transition away from fossils, and there should be respect for the free decisions of indigenous peoples. Remediation and transformation of the world, especially the rural world, is a huge opportunity in our quest for solutions based on nature. These are the solutions which we as indigenous peoples have historically practiced. They're not novel. The generation of green jobs and protection of cultural environmental heritage are at the center of this. And to bring about this necessary transformation, we require not only visibilization of the impact and the effects of climate change on indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant peoples, but we also need to enrich the knowledge and strengths of our peoples in order to achieve sustainability. We need to generate responses which are tailored to the realities of men, women and young people amongst the indigenous populations, and of intergenerational and intersectoral solutions. We as indigenous peoples have been consistently involved in international and national discussions on climate change over the last decades, and we appeal for changes which will transform the way in which climate change is addressed, as well as the crisis facing biodiversity. And we call for steps to continue in this direction alongside states and international agencies. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Mirna. Es siempre.
Thank you, Mirna. It's always a pleasure to listen to what Mirna has to say.
For your speech and for your commitment. It's very important, the studies you mentioned and the 5 points that has been listed in this study. I guess we will share this document in order for people to know it. And the idea, very concrete idea of Fondo para Puebla Indígena.
Fund for indigenous peoples.
Mirna, for your presence and for your speech. Now, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Kluane Adamek, from Yukon Regional Chief for the Assembly of First Nations from Canada. You have the floor for 7 minutes.
Thank you so much. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be. Dunj e Kluani Adamek Uye, Dachloedi Ayachat Ageo Hatua Sauk, Ganach Chish, Kwanlan Dun, Ganach Chish. My name is Kluani Adamek, and I am the elected regional chief for the Yukon region, which is a very northern part of Canada. I am from the Killer Whale people, and I shared that with you because that is our protocol. My traditional name is Age, which means daughter of the lake, and I carry my great-great-great-grandmother's name, and I'm honored to do so. This is a beautiful photo behind me of the traditional territory which I come from in northern Canada, and I want to acknowledge, of course, the territory that I'm speaking to you from, the Kwanlan and Ta'an peoples. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the incredible speakers that we've heard from, in particular, Vice President Campbell and the UNPFII chair, Anne Yorgam, of course, incredible opportunity, and thank you to the leadership, of course, event organized by Costa Rica, Spain, and the UN, United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Firstly, important to acknowledge the time we're in. This has been an unprecedented time and has had deep impacts, of course, on community. And in these moments, so important to really think about the issues that have been magnified through COVID-19. Of course, equity and access to, with respect to Indigenous peoples in terms of infrastructure, supports, healthcare services, and all of this is relative to the climate crisis that we're all responding to as human beings right around the world. In terms of the North, and I will speak a little to the Northern experience and want to acknowledge Anne, of course, who shared some of those experiences as well. When we look to the pandemic, we look to the climate state of emergency, it is really important that we also acknowledge racism and police brutality that we've seen taking place around the world in the last decades. And of course, since the initial first contact that happened in North America. It can feel very bleak. And so all of this is so important as it relates to our work nationally. The re-envisioning climate as something that isn't separate from our everyday lives, but rather that, and in the health pandemic, that it certainly has exacerbated existing structural inequities, racism, and oppression. And so only by addressing those foundational and structural problems are we able to then create hope and see that hope in addressing the climate crisis. So climate justice, Indigenous justice, racial justice. Part of this work nationally in Canada, led by First Nations, was creating a climate lens. So being very clear about what is a First Nation lens to climate. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There was a national resolution, of course, that was passed, and this included all the chiefs across the country in Canada to declare both a state of emergency, recognizing that climate change constitutes a state of emergency for our lands, waters, animals, and peoples, and being very clear that climate change is not only a change in temperature, a change in climate, but climate change really is also a people problem. And so this urgent and transformative change has required us to, in Canada, commit to reducing emissions by 60% below 2020 levels, and by 2030 to reach net zero, aiming with a goal of 2050. And so this all led to us really speaking clearly about what does this lens then look like? We're identifying all these goals. It is very clear that we're in a climate state of emergency. And so this First Nation lens was based on the alignment of three spheres. So impacts, climate action, and the broader context. So bringing into focus the First Nations multidimensional, interconnected, and interrelated solutions. And so from this perspective, it's not just a global shift and movement away from the status quo, but a revitalization of both value systems and value systems that connect us to land and the natural laws that govern our interactions with all creation. And I'm going to post in the chat something for everyone to take a look at. The nation I come from, Kluane people, our lake has gone down by 10 feet in the last 10 years. This is one of the most drastic impacts that we have seen in, of course, Northern Canada. We know that in the Arctic Circle, climate change impacts are felt 3 times more than anywhere else around the world. And the impacts that that has had on our people links to, of course, the scientific knowledge of us doing measuring and looking at what the impacts will be, but also a story of our elders that said, you need to be prepared for when Kluane Lake becomes a river. And so as we advance this important work, as we're talking about food and agriculture and the impacts of climate, it is so important that we create that space to ensure that knowledge keepers are not only included in the work, but that Indigenous peoples are included in every space and place where decisions are being made. And in particular, in our region, it really is about including the matriarchs, the elders, the women, who are always been the ones that have made decisions in our communities. So this whole concept of nothing for us without us, and I really want to acknowledge not only including Indigenous peoples, but really hearing. It's beyond listening, it's hearing what it is that Indigenous peoples both have to say, but understanding the rights that Indigenous peoples hold. And so First Nations are continuing to advance these priorities, led by values, led by traditional knowledge, and now is that opportunity for us to support and invest in grassroots resiliency efforts and ensuring that Indigenous peoples are able to be supported to continue to lead these really important solutions. And so here in Canada and First Nations across our country from coast to coast to coast are encouraging all of you to invest in Indigenous-based, Indigenous-led solutions and programs to advance the right of self-determination on the unique impacts that impact Yukon First Nations, of course, but of First Nations right across the country. So Ganach Chish, thank you, we hold you up, and really wishing all of you strength and good health in these incredibly hard times. And I will share the article for you to take a look at so you can see some of the impacts that I was talking about our territory here in Canada.
I'm muted. Thank you very much for your contribution. We are looking forward to receive the article, and if we may have a little bit more information about the state of emergency you have been talking about. Thank you. Now I will give the floor to Richard Moreno Rodríguez coordinator of Afro-Colombian National Peace Council from Colombia. And you have 7 minutes for your contribution to this panel discussion.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you all, and good afternoon, wherever you may be. We would like to greet you from Colombia. First of all, I'd like to join the proposal put forward by the Vice President of Costa Rica to forge an alliance, a partnership to discuss issues pertaining to Afro-descendant people. This is important because not only will it place us on the global radar, but also allow us to discuss amongst ourselves these issues and take action in a concerted fashion as a people of the world. Secondly, we in the Afro-Colombian National Peace Conference will be holding a conference this August, God willing. Therefore, I would like to reiterate our commitment to these two initiatives. I'd like to describe the context for Black people, what it is that our territory means to us. I'd say that territory is to Black people as Black people are to the territory. It's the main element of identity and vindication of the peoples. We are part of the life of this territory. Therefore, the effects of climate change have an impact not only on people's lives, but also the life of that territory. It can feel those impacts and suffers from those impacts just like we do as humans. That is our understanding and our worldview. The second notion I'd like to share with you is that in Colombia in 2016 we signed a peace agreement, and that peace agreement was an entire chapter, a struggle on the part of ethnic communities. Colombia's state recognizes that the territory and the ethnic population have disproportionately suffered the consequences of social and armed conflict. This means that these conflicts mostly affected these populations. The ethnic territories of the country host the greatest volumes of renewable and non-renewable natural resources. These territories, these lands, have the greatest potential in terms of protecting us from climate change and its effects and mitigating climate change. Ethnic territories are providing a buffer, not only in Colombia, but also worldwide, to ensure that those actions taken by political actors and others who are seeking to profit from these initiatives while impoverishing others can be addressed. Historically, we have sought to address these matters in Colombia. Our territories and ethnic people see the highest levels of unmet basic needs. Civil society from different sectors in the country has therefore spoken up to claim its rights, to call for a transformation of the state. However, climate change itself is having extremely harmful effects on our people's land. And I can provide you with some examples. Our main areas, which used to benefit from a natural and cultural preservation, are now suffering from variations in landscape, terrestrial fauna, loss of territory, loss of tree cover. And in our communities, a lot of our land benefits from collective land titling. In our communities, we have a community council with a legal representative, an assembly, and these collective properties are inalienable. However, we do not benefit from this land in real terms due to armed actors and other initiatives which affect the lives of our communities. We've also seen reduced productivity in the agriculture sector, which of course also affects our food security and food sovereignty. There's been greater erosion, and our soil quality has also been affected. It's important to bear in mind that we, as ethnic communities, have sought to stand up for ourselves and our views and our way of life, despite armed conflict. That is why we have sought to engender collective land titling. Black communities have over 6 million hectares of collective land. We've undertaken processes for environmentally friendly territorial management. We're handing down our traditional production methods. We've undertaken environmentally friendly production projects and are seeking to train our people when it comes to integrated territorial protection. We've also seen advances in drawing interinstitutional and organizational links in order to protect our environment. The rights of ethnic peoples, however, often fall by the wayside. We therefore need to work hard in order to have our rights recognized. For instance, some rights have been recognized through action taken by our people. 2 fundamental collective rights have been recognized: the right to land and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. This, of course, needs to be implemented because the state is often absent or complicit when it comes to the effects on our populations and our people. We managed in the Choco region in 2016 to secure a ruling from the Constitutional Court, which granted the Atrato River legal rights and ordered concrete actions to reclaim the river, which also led to our people's dignity being reclaimed, because we are a water people. There are many green funds. There are a great deal of funds which seek to address climate-related issues. However, they sit within state bodies, and in Colombia, they do not trickle down to our ethnic populations and the organizations that are truly seeking to preserve the environment, to act as a family in protecting nature, given that we feel that it is a part of us and we are a part of it. I would urge that what we discuss here be crystallized through policies that truly reflect and can help us overcome the conflict we've seen and the basic unmet needs of ethnic populations everywhere in the world. Because we refuse to harm the environment and nature. We should not take action which deprives people of their food sovereignty. These are actions against nature. This is not something we wish to engage in. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your words.
Richard Moreno Rodríguez from Afro-Colombian National Peace Council for the very concrete inputs and update you gave to the audience, to all of us. I like very much when you said el territorio para nosotros y nosotros por el territorio. I think that this is really very coherent to what we found in the Pope writings when he said recently that every one of us should belong to nature and feel really nature as part of a universe. And this allow me to welcome Cardinal Peter Turkson, Prefect of Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, who join us right now. And I will kindly ask him to have the floor for delivering his speech.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I hope I'm coming through, and I bring you all greetings from the Pontifical.
We cannot hear you.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yes, okay. Yes.
So I bring you the warm regards and good wishes of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development of the Vatican. And on his behalf, we want to share this brief message with you and congratulate all of you panelists and all speakers at this important high-level expert seminar on climate change, its impact, expanding situations of vulnerability, especially for indigenous and Afro-descendant populations and Latin American migrants. My dear friends, like in his encyclical Laudato Si, on the care for our common home, Pope Francis emphasizes the need to respond to social and environmental crises together, not to separate them. And indeed, he says that everything is interconnected, and that genuine care for our own lives and our relationship with nature is inseparable from fraternity, from justice, from our relationships with nature, and faithfulness to others. This echoes very much what his own predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, had also said. In Caritas in Veritate, Benedict XVI has said that the way we treat the environment reflects the way we treat ourselves, and that our sense of solidarity and concern for each other also reflects on the way that we treat our environment. And so, concern then for the environment and for people whose lives depend most immediately on the environment is a thing that is worth appreciating and deepening. Therefore, today's problems call for a vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crisis. And this vision is that of an integral ecology, recognizing that ecology is not only about nature, it's also about human beings, and it's about our society, and it's about the biodiversity and ecosystems that we have. And we need to hold all of them together. None of these factors is an independent variable. All of them come together to make meaning and to make sense for us. So that this connection between people and the environment, or between social systems and ecosystems, has been very, very detrimental. Today, we suffer from the loss of more than 65% of wild species, the disappearance of native forests due to the advance of our agricultural frontiers and the pollution of our waters, land, and skies with industrial waste. So through our economic, political, and social development models, at least the models of this day, we've initiated the 6th mass extinction in the history of the planet. Gradually, species are disappearing, which probably will never, our descendants or those who will come after us will never have the joy of seeing. And the climate crisis that threatens our future is increasingly impacting on indigenous communities, Afro-descendant populations, and migrants very, very negatively. Not having the technological wherewithal to adapt and to mitigate the impact of this crisis on them, they are the most, if you want, miserable in the equation. But evil and injustice, as Pope Francis tells us, are not invincible. It is possible to care for nature by changing our lifestyle and our way of life, by improving our capacity for living together and a life of communion, and bringing about profound changes in our patterns of growth, patterns of production, and patterns of consumption. In short, it is social love which is the key to authentic development. It is concern for the common good, the responsibility for the well-being of each other, regardless of the states of development levels that they find themselves in. These help us to devise larger strategies to halt environmental degradation and to encourage and develop a culture of care, which permeates all society. So, my dear friends, I think we must try to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, exemplified especially by the suffering of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, as well as the very many who are constrained to move from their land and homes, the migrants. We must listen to their frustration and anger, sorrow and weeping at losing their homes to extractive industries and individualistic economic models of growth and concern. We must have some concern and have some tenderness of heart to those who are being marginalized and discarded by an ever more individualistic society and its development patterns, having their culture threatened by globalized indifference. Yet, we have much to learn from them. Their traditional wisdom provides a key to dealing with a whole lot of basic forms of social problems and environmental issues, from the way they interact with nature, the harmonious relationship between them and nature, and how they maintain a biodiversity system which mutually promotes the growth of each and the other element. So we must listen to their message of hope, creativity, and act now to ensure a better future for them and for future generations. Now, my dear friends, more than ever, it is time to act, to do something concrete. We can all change for a just and a sustainable future, and we must think new models and deepen our sense of social responsibility in all aspects of social life, from our economic behavior to our political decisions. We need to recognize our role as ecological citizens and make the world a greener and a better place, healthier for all of us, with a view to the most vulnerable among us, and develop a more sustainable pattern and more robust systems of life support systems. In this regard, we want to commend the initiatives taken by some Latin American countries, Chile, Peru, to adopt some international legislations to protect indigenous populations and ensure and protect their rights. Indeed, it has become clear that in globalized culture, indigenous populations sometimes become victims to corporations who come from outside and impose legislations from their countries of origin, while the indigenous populations and the local populations do not share anything with the citizens, with the nations out of which the developers have come. So at a certain point, we need to have recourse to the guidance of international legislations to protect the well-being of indigenous populations and to ensure their care. Pope Francis, therefore, has invited all of us to join forces to dream and to prepare the future. To dream and to prepare the future means preparing a future which is rid of all the challenges and the defects of the present in our structures and systems that we're dealing with. This means recognizing that even if things look bleak, as they are not set in stone, it is worth looking for economic models, technological models, and social models which will help humanity create a more just world and not return to a world of inequality and a world of deprivation and a world of stepping on the poor, such as indigenous populations and people of Afro descent. And so as we try, my dear friends, to prepare the future, we can also recognize that it is time to embrace new opportunities. For this again is what Pope Benedict told us, that in a period of crisis, we don't need to throw up our hands in despair. Rather, we need to recognize the positive elements of our culture and development, hang on to them, embrace them, and make them the new trajectories along which to travel towards redeeming and improving upon the future that lies ahead of us. So there is no sustainability without fairness. There's no sustainability without justice and without involving everyone, especially the poorest and the most marginalized people. Ours is to try to make the poor, the indigenous, and the Afro-descendant people protagonists of their development and their future. It's not up to us to design it for them. We need to empower them. We need to make them protagonists of all of their future, of their well-being, and of their own fitting well in their own natural habitats and environment, without removing from them the possibility of growth and development. So we must involve all voices and all wisdom, including traditional wisdom, indigenous wisdom. This is why I am honored and I'm glad to have been included in this distinguished panel. So I'd like to thank you all for including the Vatican Dicastery in this conversation. And I trust that the consent that has been expressed, the impact of Pope Francis' own writing in Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, all of this will provide information and data that will help us relate more positively to people of indigenous descent, people of Afro-descendant, and help them adapt and deal more profitably and usefully in this tough situation of climate change, global warming, and all the adverse impact that it may have on them. So we wish this panel great success, and we wish to thank all the very many speakers who have shared their great wisdom with us, and working together in synodality and solidarity to promote the well-being of indigenous populations, and especially people of African American descent, and the earth, our common home. So thank you for this opportunity and this occasion to share thoughts with you. And we commend this high-level panel to a very successful end and adaptation of all its recommendations and procedures. So thank you again, Mr. Moderator. Thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you.
Thank you. Thank you. We are the one to thank you for your presence, and we are honored to have you in this high-level seminar. I will personally keep in mind what you said. It's time to embrace new opportunities. I think that this is really a very strong and inspiring message you have been giving us. Thank you very much. Now we will move to listen Mr. Alexis Neuberg, President of Africa-Europe Diaspora Development Platform. You have 7 minutes for your introduction. Vous avez la parole, Monsieur Neuberg.
You have the floor, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Your Excellencies, representatives of the various countries, Director General and analysts, ladies and gentlemen. It's very difficult to speak. I've deleted a lot of what I was going to say because people have already said it. So there's been some very eloquent and interesting words from the Vice President of Costa Rica. We've listened to Anne Norgam, who's mentioned all of the issues pertaining to climate change as they relate to migration, and you yourself have said what the Cardinal said about how we stand vis-a-vis each other. Well, 7 minutes. It's going to be a lot of time to fill now, and I could stop here. Having said this, over the last 10 years, the international community has paid special attention to strengthening the battle against climate change and promoting human rights. With global warming, water shortages, desertification, and these are all deemed to be major changes resulting from climate change. And all of these phenomena also stem from very grave problems affecting human rights, the right to life, the right to health, housing, and so on, even cultural development. That is why I take this opportunity to welcome this initiative, especially our cooperation with the FAO, and I especially want to welcome the joint efforts of Costa Rica, Spain, and the Holy See to support those most affected by climate change, particularly addressing the issues of Afro-descendants in the light of these current crises. With the COVID-19 pandemic now coming to the fore over the last year. And this initiative is part and parcel now of the International Decade on Afro-descendant populations 2015-2024, and the International Decade for Afro-descendants means justice, rights and development, and it stresses once more the relevance of the important seminars that have been held. And we've seen one of the most serious crises now faced by the global communities, one of the greatest public health crises affecting our ability to work and to move, and it affects all our activities. Now, deterioration of the climate may affect the whole global community and force people to migrate. But the inhabitants of the poorest countries are much more likely to be compelled to migrate because of it. And there have been a lot of analyses which have been carried out. And climate and environment deterioration have particularly serious repercussions on the poorest countries and the most socially vulnerable groups, the most disadvantaged groups, and the people living in rural and farming lands are more frequently and more heavily affected by climate stress factors, and they have to leave the places where they live, and they have to relinquish their livelihoods. So we're trying to establish a relationship between climate change and migration. Now, if we turn this into a proper approach, the LDC countries are doubly affected by global warming and above all by conflict and climate change generated conflict and the depletion of vital resources. So you have these crises, hunger and conflict, which compel people to leave. Now, as a representative of the Africa-Europe Diaspora Development Platform, I want to talk about the people who are doubly affected, and I want to approach this from a different angle to what's been said before. That is, immigrants who have come in because of climate change. So these are a direct consequence of climate change. And the second point of interest to us is that these people who are doubly penalized by displacement come to countries where they are in turn marginalized. Nonetheless, they contribute in a major way to the development both of the countries they've left, the countries of origin, but also the countries to which they migrate. And that is why I want to focus with these few minutes on this phenomenon, marginalization of people who are actually an asset and who are useful. And that's why I think it's important to grasp the opportunities, and these people are an opportunity. By way of example, ladies and gentlemen, when many countries opened their borders, we saw an African diaspora that remained active in both Europe and in Africa. So although borders closed then during the pandemic, and because there was a lot of crisis, they nonetheless stayed. And that reminds us of the fact that governments must begin to develop policies which will bolster this opportunity that these people represent. They champion their countries of origin, but they also contribute to the countries to which they move. And I also, therefore, want to refer to another element which is very important, and that is that Afro-descendant people, because of their international nature and their status, must now constantly fight to have access to essential rights, right to life, first and foremost, which goes without repeating. And they have to fight for life. And so this needs us to reflect on whether we're properly protecting these people who are vulnerable in their countries of origin and then become vulnerable in the countries to which they move. And that is why emphasis needs to be placed on a renewal of policies to deal with socio and economic factors from which Afro-descendant people suffer. And this has been highlighted during this public health crisis. Nonetheless, the inventorization and collection of data of a religious nature should be prohibited in countries, and ethnicity and vulnerability and economic and social deprivation are interrelated. So we need to get to grips with that problem. There are practices which prevent other actions being taken. And the people of African origin in Europe also suffer from major racial discrimination, which reduces their chances of getting jobs and having access to decent housing, which is not just social housing. And we also have the problems of relations between the judiciary and the police, where those relations have become much more violent and difficult since the start of the pandemic. So, as I said, we shouldn't remain closeted in the past, and that is why I want to support the initiative referred to by by the Cardinal, because he talked about looking to the future, and we need to produce policies which are future-oriented and positive. Climate change has caused some 20 million displaced people in more than 40 countries, and with this tragic situation, it's vital that we take genuine measures and not just provide lip service, given the racism and racial discrimination against vulnerable populations, including Afro-descendant people, especially in Europe. It is urgent for political decision makers and the international community to bring about a paradigm shift. There is irrefutable evidence that climate change increases inequalities between countries and within countries and between the different communities, thus creating a conflict with the elites around the world. So as of now, as we've had a good example with the FAO, we need to ensure Afro-descendants are consulted in policy making, in dealing with climate change, and they need to be included in local, national and international decision-making bodies. Secondly, funding of action and programs should allow these populations to adapt to climate change, and they should be geared towards mitigation. Thirdly, there needs to be a major mobilization of the international community and the development of policies which will deal with their problems specifically. Fourthly, the inclusion of Afro-descendant people in society should become a political priority. The European Union has shown the way with its action plan against racism for 2020-2025 and its action plan for integration and inclusion for 2021 to 2027. All countries where Afro-descendant people live must get to grips with this issue, which has historical roots. And lastly, decision makers must take a closer interest in the correlation between historical discrimination against minorities, including Afro-descendants in Europe, and the measures which are taken to deal with climate change. If that action is done, then those actions will be much more relevant. So public policy to deal with climate change and social discrimination should be dealt with hand in hand. And I've already said it, but I'll say it again. We've already seen a good example in the partnership with the FAO, and it's this sort of cooperation with the key stakeholders which will make these activities legitimate. And that is the message we convey to you today. There needs to be consultation and cooperation. As our friend from Colombia said, we must heed people's voices and address those issues in the decisions which are taken, which affect all society. I hope I've been sufficiently brief so that there is still time for a discussion. Thank you. It's for me to thank you, Alexis Neuberg, for having introduced into our debate the question of Afro-descendant peoples in Europe and their double role vis-à-vis the countries of origin and the countries to which they move. And thank you for the 5 points you've listed, and above all, thank you for restating your resolve to work with the FAO on these issues. So thank you very much for your statement. I now give the floor with great pleasure to Jan Fernandez de la Rinoa, the chief of what here is called the Indigenous Peoples Unit of the FAO, for his presentation, and I'd above all like to thank him for his commitment to the issues we are discussing this afternoon.
Jean-Léonard, c'est toujours...
Thank you very much, Jean-Léonard.
By thanking all the speakers that spoke today and all the dignitaries that have joined us. I think it's a great pleasure to speak about the work that we are doing on Indigenous peoples, and many of the things that we are doing, of course, apply to Afro-descendants and are extremely relevant. I would like to acknowledge also the presence of Vasavi Kiro. Vasavi Kiro is an indigenous woman from India. She's an expert on herbs and medicinal plants. And I think she really incarnates the words that Vice President Campbell said at the beginning, the important role that indigenous women and Afro-descendant women play in biodiversity conservation and to combat climate change. This might go unnoticed in other agencies, but certainly not in FAO, where we put indigenous women and Afro-descendant women at the center of the knowledge as knowledge holders. Allow me to share my screen, Jean-Léonard, and I'm going to zoom through a presentation on to expand a little bit on many of the things that have been already introduced masterfully by Anne Norgan, Vice President Campbell, and all the previous speakers. So let me show you a little bit about indigenous peoples. I think you can see my screen. And now, indigenous peoples are more than 476 million people across the world, living in 90 countries. If they were put together in a single country, this will be the third most populous country in the world. So we need to ask all of us, why is that we are not paying enough attention to the knowledge and what they have to teach us? But more important than that is they speak the majority of the language that are existing in the world, and they represent more than 5,000 different cultural groups. This is the work program of FAO with indigenous peoples. It was designed jointly with them, and you can see there how it matches extremely well the 4 betters of the new FAO strategic program. I will be talking today about indigenous peoples' food systems, but also about indigenous peoples' knowledge and climate change. And let me say that indigenous peoples' knowledge and climate change, we are working on this thanks to the fact that the indigenous youth, when they met with FAO senior management in 2017, they told us that FAO had forgotten an extremely important pillar of work with indigenous peoples, and this is traditional knowledge and climate change. Indigenous youth, of course, they are the future of the food systems, and it was extremely refreshing to see how concerned they were about the importance of their traditional knowledge in maintaining alive the practices of their ancestors. The work of FAO with indigenous peoples goes a long way, and already in the voluntary guidelines on the right to food, the linkage between food security, right to food, and territories and lands was very well spelled out. Very important is the 2010 FAO policy on indigenous peoples that is built around free, prior, and informed consent, self-determined development, and the recognition of the cultural identity of indigenous peoples. In 2015, indigenous peoples requested officially to FAO to create a task force to work on indigenous peoples' food systems. And this is important. We do set up a methodology to profile indigenous peoples across the world, indigenous peoples' food systems, looking at sustainability and resilience. And we did that with a partnership with Biodiversity International, but also a number of indigenous organizations. In 2018, we had the pleasure to host a high-level expert seminar on indigenous peoples' food systems with more than 200 participants. And the main output of this high-level expert seminar was the need to have a global hub on indigenous peoples' food systems that has already been mentioned by Mirna, by Anne Norgan, and the previous speakers. Very important is that this global hub on indigenous peoples' food systems was endorsed by the member countries at the Technical Committee of Agriculture in September 2020. We all agree that indigenous peoples' food systems are biodiverse systems. This is the ongoing research we are doing in the field with indigenous peoples across the world and several organizations, and the research only confirms that biodiversity richness that we all know and that somehow we need to take more into account in the work we do. But what is very interesting is that if we overlay indigenous peoples' territories with national parks and protected areas, there is a tremendous coincidence. And this is very important because if we could add another map of biodiversity, culture, and language, we will see the overlap and the connection between languages, biodiversity, cultural diversity, and the protection of the environment. 80% of the remaining biodiversity is in indigenous peoples' lands and territories today. So this is the connection between health, nutrition, but also language and culture, and natural resource and biodiversity that indigenous peoples masterfully practice day to day in their homes and in their territories. And why is language so important? It's extremely important because to broaden the food base and to really learn and understand from indigenous peoples, we need to look at language. Language is fundamental because it's what keeps alive the knowledge of many of these food systems, and is really what is transmitted orally, intergenerational, but also intragenerational. When we started the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples Food Systems, we were welcomed by by the enthusiasm of several research and academic organizations that wanted to join us, from the University of Cambridge to CIFOR, from Massey University in New Zealand to Gaia Amazonas, Monash University, and not only the Sami Parliament and the UN Permanent Forum. We are all working together, and one of the things that we are doing is to share the evidence that indigenous people's food systems can really share with the world. Something very important is the WIPALA paper that it was already mentioned, and this has been a co-creation of knowledge that we have done through the Global Hub. We have coordinated the drafting of this paper with more than 60 contributors from across the world, the large majority indigenous peoples. And this is fundamental because the WIPALA paper has been accepted by the scientific group of the UN Food System Summit as the contribution from indigenous peoples towards the scientists and the different policymakers that are informing the way forward towards the UN Food System Summit. So what are some of the take-home messages? Well, the first one is certainly that indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants are not vulnerable. Marginalization, discrimination, and violence, and now climate change is putting them in increased situations of vulnerability, and we must do something altogether about this. Indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants might be financially poor, but they are rich in biodiversity and culture, and we need to account for this richness that they have. Indigenous peoples protect 80% of the remaining biodiversity that let us remind all of us that it has been destroyed elsewhere and in other societies. Indigenous youth, they are the present and future of indigenous peoples' food and knowledge systems, and we must engage them and work with them if we want them to be the policymakers of tomorrow. Indigenous peoples are fundamental allies against climate change, but also on biodiversity protection, sustainability, resilience, and the broadening of the food base, as well as food generation. Languages, cosmogony, beliefs, culture, and biodiversity, they are essential, and they go hand in hand in indigenous peoples' food systems. And the mobility and collective rights, an area of work that is essential for indigenous peoples, and it is essential for biodiversity protection that many of us, we do not understand enough about, and we need to do more research, and we need to learn more about the mobile techniques and the mobile territorial management systems that indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants have, as well as their collective rights and how they manage natural resources. Countries are essential, and it's by working together through the Rome group of friends of indigenous peoples in Rome that it was started in 2019 and is chaired by Canada, or the New York group of friends of indigenous peoples started after 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that is chaired by Mexico. It's through forging alliances that we can change the current, we can meet the current challenges we all face. What can we do together? Certainly ensure legal recognitions of collective rights, but also ensure that the relevant legislation is aligned with international human rights agreed standards. Ensure that indigenous people's engagement in policy and decision-making processes is effective and takes place at different levels. And we need to adopt policies and programs that are culturally appropriate and that include interculturality. The respect of the right of free, prior, and informed consent is fundamental to respect indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants' rights, but also the recognition of indigenous peoples as some of the best experts in preserving biodiversity and fight against climate change. And many ideas were put on the table, extremely practical for policymakers to adopt by the previous speakers, and certainly something that we should discuss during the questions and answers. But also very important to enhance and preserve indigenous people's food systems in the frame of the 2021 UN Food System Summit, but also beyond. Thank you so much, Jean-Laurent, for the use of the word, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, my friend Jon, for your presentation. Very interesting presentation. And I guess that even this document will be shared with the audience and with all our partners and stakeholders. Now, I would like to introduce to you with great pleasure René Castro Salazar, Assistant Director General, who will be part of the next session, an opening brainstorming. René, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Jean-Leonard.
Thank you, Jean-Leonard.
Tengo el honor de introducir.
I have the honor of introducing two eminent individuals from two countries who have had a major impact on the issues discussed at this event, well beyond their own borders, indeed. They are with us on this panel. They are Her Excellency Beatriz Argimon, the Vice President of Uruguay, and His Excellency Charles Pearnel, Minister of Housing, Urban Renewal, Environment and Climate Change of Jamaica. Uruguay and its diaspora have had an impact throughout Latin America and Europe, in countries such as Argentina or Italy, and in culture and politics today, a country which has experienced major emigration during the years of the dictatorship, and now it's a model democracy and is geared to inclusive, sustainable development. And I therefore have great pleasure in introducing to you Her Excellency Beatriz Argimon. You have the floor, Vice President. Thank you. Warm greetings from Uruguay to all the participants. It really is an honor and source of great pleasure for me to be able to take part in this high-level expert seminar, and huge thanks to those who've been able to make it possible for us to be sharing this experience today. And I convey a warm welcome to the Director General of the FAO. May I also express my warmth towards the first Vice President of Costa Rica, my friend Epsy Campbell, and we acknowledge her long experience. And I know that in the development of this panel and this exchange of views, we need to recall the passing of our Minister of the Interior, who was a key figure in this work. Now, having expressed our thanks for all of these things, I'd like to say that the climate change issue is and must continue to be a priority in the cross-cutting action of all the bodies of the state, especially because of the particular vulnerability Uruguay faces because of the potential and actual effects of climate change. Undoubtedly, this is essential if we are to be able to achieve sustainable development in the country, including the building of a more resilient society with a greater ability to adapt to climate change and climate variability. The recent creation of an environment ministry. Previously, we had a housing and a land management and environment ministry, and the current executive has established a specific ministerial portfolio for the environment, and that is a clear signal of how we are hierarchizing our priorities and putting climate change in pride of place. And one of the most key hallmarks of Uruguay is that its productive and economic system is rooted in areas which are affected by climate, such as livestock, agriculture and tourism. And we are seeking to achieve agricultural production which is ever more sustainable, protecting natural ecosystems, biodiversity and our soils through various policies and then different plans and programs. And we are working on a long-term climate strategy to bring about development with low greenhouse gas emissions, and the aim is to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. And the most frequent phenomenon which we're affected by is flooding caused by the overflowing of rivers and dams as a result of torrential rains, which gives rise to displacement of peoples, and it affects their food, health and housing and economic prospects because of destruction of their private property and destruction of livestock and farming land. And the National Emergency System, developed through the joint work of the Environment Ministry and local governments, registers the zones affected by river overflooding, and estimates show that more than 95,000 people and 30,000 homes are in areas which have been flooded. And with these figures, we've been developing a strategy geared to ensuring that the people in greatest vulnerability are properly registered. In June of 2020, we had a national plan for drainage and dealing with flooding in order to provide sustainable management of urban water, systematizing information on flooding and river systems in the country. Other actions are related to the governance model in Uruguay. As the representative of the FAO, Mr. Castro, said, our country is one which is intimately related with emigration, and we've tried to maintain ties with people who've migrated, and we've taken key steps in recent years with people who've migrated elsewhere on the Latin American continent, but also have gone to Europe. And when it comes to our policy, which has been published this year, our country has reported on its efforts to register displacement of people and humanitarian action drawn up jointly with the United Nations in order to take into account the fact that the country faces a high risk of flooding. And we also have a national environmental plan whose aim is to reduce the risk population groups by some 50%, so that we have proper human settlement programs in the event of an emergency. In 2009, we had a national climate change response system put in place. In Latin America, 1 in 4 inhabitants are or consider themselves to be indigenous or Afro-descendant. In Uruguay, the Afro-descendants are the largest minority in Uruguay and produce some of the poorest economic results. Nonetheless, 8% of our population, of our policies rather, are geared to this population. And yet large numbers have indigenous roots. Climate change is having a major impact very frequently on our society. Flooding, evacuation, displacement are the consequences of a policy which has been highlighted by climate change risks and which has to be revamped nationally. And it's true that the most seriously affected communities as regards climate change are those with the worst problems of income inequality and also gender inequality. Now, obviously, this exchange of views and our reflection and proposals at this important seminar must lead to policies which are more beneficial for the most vulnerable populations, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, migrants, for Latin America, the US and Canada. And I'd like to conclude in the light of the time constraints by expressing gratitude again for this forum for exchange of views, because in this globalized world and in this constantly changing world, a world of such uncertainty, such meetings are extremely important, where we may tackle the issues which are affecting us so seriously and do it together. So thank you once again for allowing me to be here and for allowing me to learn from everything you've been saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President.
Jamaica. Jamaica and its diaspora have a profound influence on the music, food, and tradition of Afro-descendants communities throughout the Americas and in the United Kingdom. It is not a coincidence that today Vice Presidents Harris from the US and Campbell from Costa Rica are both from Jamaican origin. They represent the first example of Afro-descendant women elected in their respective countries. The historical influence of Jamaica is still an object of study. Its role in the independence of many nations in Latin America, and a century later in Africa. Now we have the honor to offer the floor to Minister Charles Pearnel. Minister, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. And let me say how much of an honor it is to have been invited to join this dialogue. And as you have said, we here in Jamaica do recognize our Vice President of Costa Rica as our very own. And so I just want to especially acknowledge her, as well as my colleague, Vice President from Uruguay, who spoke so eloquently a while ago, the Director General of FAO, Cardinal, all of the distinguished excellencies and friends on this call. This is such an important discussion, and it connects to what is arguably the most insidious phenomenon of our generation. And so I want to express my gratitude on behalf of the people and government of Jamaica for the opportunity to have our voices to be heard at this forum. We know that the impact of climate change has serious implications for the lives, livelihoods, food and water security, infrastructure, housing, commercial activity, the sustainable development of our countries and the well-being of our citizens. What is important is that this changing climate does not discriminate at all between ethnicity, nationality, gender, socioeconomic status, jobs, nor ages. The impact is felt across the board, but there are some that are more vulnerable. In Jamaica, we have a saying, our great singer and poet, Bob Marley, said that rain don't fall on one man's house, which means that the impact of climate change is affecting all of us. But we do recognize that there are vulnerable groups. And in Jamaica, we have a majority of our people being of African descent. They comprise the largest ethnic grouping in our country. And such, our issues are not substantially about ethnicity as much as it is about socio-economic status. Indeed, for those of us who occupy the lower socio-economic grouping in our country, the effects of climate change are disproportionate compared with others who are more economically well off. In Jamaica, for instance, we take our well-known Maroons, who are among one of the groups that are recognized globally of being from Afro descent. And they have maintained ties to the land and its resources for sustenance. Our farmers, our fishers are disproportionately vulnerable to the varied impacts of climate change, including hurricanes, including floods, landslides, droughts, heavy winds, soil erosion, and land degradation. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, people who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, or otherwise marginalized are especially vulnerable to the climate change impact and also to some adaptation and mitigation responses. It is therefore in the best interest of all of us, all governments and policymakers, to understand and frame this reality in pursuit of sustained development for our people, our economies, and our countries. The conversation and sustainable use of natural resources must therefore be inscribed in public policies and legislation if the livelihood of our population is to be sustained. And that must be our goal. It is our collective objective. For us in Jamaica, for me, as a minister with portfolio responsibility for housing, I must also note that informal settlements remain a serious risk in terms of climate hazards for the occupants. They are primarily and usually the poorest and most vulnerable. So we are focusing on that, and our policies and programs will reflect the importance we have placed on protecting that vulnerable group. In addition to increasing the stock of low-income housing in our country and building resilience to climate change impacts through proper planning and housing developments, we have focused on this as a priority, and we have injected creative mechanisms such as competitions, design competitions, all to ensure that we can get the cost to be low cost and effective in advancing the resilience that we require for our people. There are also clearly stated policy intentions to create no-build zones in areas which are exposed to hazards. And we have been working on identifying disaster-prone areas in our country and incorporating this information into how we plan, all in an attempt to reduce risk and for us to become more climate resilient. Marcella, you know, and we know, the evidence of a changed climate is manifest and manifold around us. Countries in Latin America, and especially the Caribbean, are characterized by beaches, hotels, roadways, international airports. I know that Ruben Flores, for instance, loves to go to our hotels. So we know that we have to protect these assets in our country. And I'm pleased here to note that Jamaica is among the first globally to begin developing a predictive climate risk assessment planning tool for major infrastructure areas. So, my friend Rene Castro, you will be pleased to note that the work that we're doing in Jamaica is being facilitated through partnership between the public sector and the private sector, led by the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. This tool will enable decision makers to access climate risk and to assess the risk for us to build resilient. We're going to visualize our hotspots and make sure that we take proactive action to protect our people. And we're testing this tool beginning June of this year. So as I close, ladies and gentlemen, the losses that we have already experienced and will continue to suffer if climate change is not mitigated are incalculable. And in many instances, unfortunately, irreversible, particularly for the poorest among us. At the very least, our people, and indeed all people of the world ought to be given the chance to live, grow, develop, and pursue happiness. Climate change is disruptive, regressive, and threatens the very existence of our planet. It is therefore a clear violation of the rights of humanity. That is why Jamaica will continue to enact policies that steer our efforts to rebuild the economy from the COVID-19 pandemic. We will strive to pursue a green recovery as an inclusive process taking into account the socially vulnerable communities that lack capacity to respond. I thank you, and I wish us all the best as we continue to listen to this wonderful virtual dialogue. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much. Marcela, now over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I think we have had a fantastic exchange of ideas, of concepts, of common threads of analysis, of points that we will be following through from FAO and into the future. I'd like to thank every one of the panelists. I'd like to thank every one of those of you who contributed also through the chat. I didn't see any question coming through the chat, but many people have been making contacts among themselves, and I hope that will continue. It's been a really rich and interesting discussion. Now it's time for us to go to the closing. And I have the great pleasure to give the floor to Anne Norgam, who, as we all know, is the chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, for your final thoughts. Anne, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marcela. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I may say that this has been an excellent event. I'm thrilled to hear the government's representatives and Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants and migrants are discussing issues of great concern for themselves, but also for humanity. From what I have heard today, there is a clear message. We all must act, and now. As have been highlighted during this seminar, climate change poses threats and dangers to the survival of Indigenous peoples worldwide. Even though the Paris Agreement recognized the need to strengthen the traditional knowledge, technologies, practices, and efforts of Indigenous peoples, that provision has not been enforced yet by countries. Climate change has impacted and will continue to impact Indigenous peoples, our livelihoods, health, and cultures in unpredictable and potentially devastating ways. Many climate change adaptation planning tools fail to address the unique needs, values, and cultures of Indigenous peoples because we are not engaged in decision-making processes. As a result, warming temperatures, uncertainty about seasons, extreme weather events, faster ice break up, water insecurity, to mention some examples of disruption of our livelihoods affecting our survival. These negative impact our methods of harvesting, preservation, and food preparation, and availability of fishing and hunting food species. The role of Indigenous peoples is a key perception of changes in the climate system, and coping strategies of Indigenous peoples are intimately linked to our traditional knowledge and cosmovision. Monitoring and understanding these changes are essential to adaptation. For instance, the Wipala paper details some of the researchers have taken the initiative to design and offer place-based, value-driven case studies on climate change health impact assessments from the indigenous perspectives. The results provide decision makers and climate adaptation teams with the technical data and values-based evidence to design better solutions that are more responsive to community priorities to be implemented and supported by the community. This confirms once more that Indigenous peoples are great allies in the fight against the climate change. Indigenous peoples will continue providing solutions based on its traditional knowledge, cosmovisions, food systems, and the relationship with its territory and nature. Dear friends, it is of great importance to address land tenure issues and participatory rights as a precondition for guaranteeing full and effective exercise of Indigenous peoples' rights, and for us to continue providing benefits to the fight to climate change. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has upheld multiple times that it is crucial to ensure full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in the elaboration of state-developed mitigation measures, guided by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to ensure that these measures do not negatively affect Indigenous peoples. Also, the Permanent Forum have stated that enhancing and supporting the adaptive capacity of Indigenous peoples will only be successful if this is integrated with other strategies such as disaster preparation, land use planning, environmental conservation, and national plans for sustainable development. In this frame, the Permanent Forum urges UN agencies, states, and organizations to take actions to these issues by adapting measures to fight climate change, making sure a meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples. Thank you very much. Kiitos.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Anne. We have three more persons who will intervene in the closing remarks. We do have limited time of interpretation, so I'd like to ask all of our people who are going to intervene to stick to their allocated time. En este momento tengo el gran placer de darle...
It's now a great pleasure for me to give the floor to Maximo Torero-Cullen, our chief economist here at FAO. Maximo, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Marcela.
Of Costa Rica, Spain, Uruguay, Jamaica, and Holy See, representative of Indigenous Peoples, Afro-descendants and Migrants. Dear all, I am very happy to be here with you all at this important high-level event. Today we reflect together on what is placing Indigenous people, Afro-descendants and Migrants in situations of vulnerability and how climate change is fueling this process. In a recent study on forest governance by Indigenous and tribal peoples, FAO found that Indigenous and tribal peoples are involved in the communal governance of between 320 and 380 million hectares of forest in Latin America. More than 80% of the area occupied by Indigenous people is covered with forest. However, climate change threatens Indigenous people and Afro-descendant traditional livelihoods, identity, and cultural survival. In this context, the first point I would like to raise is related to the impacts of climate change. Today, we have heard that climate change, its environmental constraints and impacts exacerbated difficulties faced by Indigenous people, Afro-descendants peoples, including the lack of recognition, lack of respect for collective rights, and discrimination, violence, and criminalization. Indigenous and Afro-descendant speakers have emphasized enough that they are among the first to face the consequences of climate change due to the direct dependence on close relationships with the land and natural resources. We have also observed how climate change and natural disasters and loss of livelihoods increase migration to the urban areas and force relocation of Indigenous people in Afro-descendant populations as their lands become uninhabitable. I want to highlight that migration is not the same for all. Underlying conditions of inequality and vulnerability could limit mobility. and represents a significant risk to cope with climate and environmental change. Therefore, my second point is that we will need to work all together in innovative ways to contend with these realities. Fortunately, indigenous people and Afro-descendants can interpret and react to the impacts of climate change in creative ways, drawing on traditional knowledge and other technologies to find solutions. In 2021, the UN Food System Summit frame of FAO is working with indigenous peoples to ensure their effective participation during and beyond the summit. Part of this effort is the White WIPALA paper drafted by the Global Hub of Indigenous Peoples Food Systems. Remarkably, the White WIPALA paper effectively shows that indigenous peoples' food systems can contribute to debates on sustainable food systems, biodiversity, conservation, climate change, migration, restoration, and resilience. From the evidence shared, allow me to retake the words of the FAO Director General asserting that it is necessary to collaborate hand in hand with indigenous people and Afro-descendant peoples. We need to build beneficial partnerships with them, recognize their collective tenure rights, contribute to biodiversity, and then build collective strategies to mitigate climate change. In this regard, it is crucial to recognize and value the role of indigenous and Afro-descendant women in response to climate change due to their local knowledge, leadership, and territorial management practices. Also, it is urgent to recognize the contribution of indigenous youth in biodiversity, climate change, and zero hunger by using new technologies and platforms of spread traditional knowledge. Additionally, it is pivotal to combine indigenous people traditional knowledge, innovation, and technology, and establish a dialogue of knowledge that retrofits both and benefits humankind. In this process, collaborative alliances and solid partnerships across different actors and knowledge holders are essential. Alliances between governments and the UN indigenous organizations and academia. It is central to understand that the holistic way in which indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants look at the environment, the culture, and the way they operate day to day is a core message of how we should approach the systems, how we should approach our agri-food systems, so that we can really cope in a systematic way with this risk of climate change. I would like, therefore, to thank you for having invited me to this event, and really want to make a call again that we need to learn a lot from how this is done through indigenous people and Afro-descendants, and how we can bring all this knowledge into the transformation that we need today, and especially to be able to increase the resilience to climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Maximo. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Lisa Famolare, who is Vice President of Nature for Climate for the Americas in Conservation International, for her brief final thoughts. Please, you have the floor, Lisa.
Hi, thank you so much to everybody for having me here. I'm really grateful and humbled by the opportunity to participate in this high-level dialogue and panel and to learn from all of you. And I guess first I want you all to know that I will take what you have all said back to my organization, Conservation International, and integrate it into the work that I do in conserving the Amazon. So what did we learn today? We learned a lot of things. And one of the first things is that in 2020, more people were displaced by extreme climate than conflict, which is really incredible if you think about it. And this is only going to grow as the impacts of climate change increase around the world. We know that indigenous and Afro-descendant populations are among the world's most vulnerable people to climate change, yet they're often the most successful and hold the most knowledge and wisdom for maintaining their forests and nature. Indigenous and local and Afro-descendant communities manage or have tenure rights to 25% of the Earth's land surface. They're really important for solving the climate crisis together. In Latin America and the Caribbean alone, indigenous territories store over 1/8 of the world's tropical forest carbon and house most of the endangered species and wild animal and plant species of the world. We also know that while there's growing evidence that indigenous peoples' rights to land and benefit sharing are essential to meeting our local and global climate and conservation goals, there are still huge gaps in recognizing these rights. So it's important for us all to work to rectify that together. This is particularly the case in the Amazon forest, one of the world's largest carbon sinks, home to the richest biodiversity of any ecosystem on the planet. Human-made fires and forest conversion for agriculture and mining and timber are bringing the Amazon to a critical tipping point that'll have irreversible consequences for people, wildlife, and the planet for all of us. So we have to work together to solve this crisis. Indigenous people in the Amazon own over 25% of the forest. At least that's what's recognized. There's so much more that they do. And evidence shows that Indigenous territories have lower rates of deforestation and lower risk of wildfire across the Amazon region, which is also an incredible fact. So what does it tell us? It tells us that the only way to solve this global climate crisis is with the support of Indigenous and local communities. We simply can't do it without them. We need everybody at the table and we need to support them. So what do we have to do? We have to expand and strengthen Indigenous people and local community rights over their lands and their territories and their resources. Rights to their territories are paramount. We have to strengthen IPLC leadership and support management of their lands and enable them to protect the forests they live in against growing encroachment and climate change, and incorporate that traditional knowledge and wisdom into our science-based decision-making, because there's so much that we can learn. I really believe that if we don't, we're all toast. So we're at this moment, and hearing all of you today, gave me hope that we're all working and in this together, and we can really make this change. I mean, as Cardinal Turkson mentioned, we're all interconnected across the globe. And as the minister from Jamaica mentioned, Bob Marley's quote about rain doesn't fall on one man's head. And then I guess in closing, I also want to quote the incredible Pope Francis, who has said, we're not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and one social, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. So together with all of you, with Indigenous and local communities, Afro-descendant populations, and all of us, I'm positive that we can win this battle against climate change. And I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to be here and to meet all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Lisa Famolare, and thank you for that note of hope towards the future. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Bruno Oberle, who's Director General, International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marcela. Your Excellencies, partner, friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to deliver some closing remarks at this high-level expert seminar and to conclude today's rich event on such an important subject. All of us know that Indigenous people are among those who have contributed the least to climate change. Yet they are also among those affected the worst by climate crisis. Allowing them to suffer is not just a human catastrophe and a natural catastrophe. Conserving nature and empowering people are both key components of a sustainable development. Over the years, IUCN have been privileged to work with Indigenous people and local communities, supporting their rights and roles in conservation. We have promoted Indigenous knowledge through our research and through the voices of Indigenous peoples organizations, which we are very proud to count among IUCN almost 1,500 members. It is a fact that Indigenous community hold crucial knowledge to help us to live more sustainable lives. Through their traditional knowledge and deep experience in natural resource stewardship, Indigenous communities offer the world's valuable insight and strategies. For example, forests governed by Indigenous people are associated with lower rates of deforestation, lower carbon emissions, and higher carbon storage, especially where tenure rights are secured. Furthermore, 22% of the total carbon found in tropical and subtropical forests is located on land managed by Indigenous community, showing that their engagement is critical for us to effective global climate mitigation. At the same time, Indigenous people face great hardship, and this has only increased during the COVID pandemic. Indigenous people organization in IUCN's membership have reported that they now face increased health risks, food insecurity, gender-based violence, and the loss of their employment and livelihood. Yet even through their hardship, the Indigenous people organization that are our members have proposed solutions, which I am proud to share with you. For instance, we can increase traditional indigenous land tenure for the governance of land and resources. We can also enact or strengthen laws that empower indigenous community governance and management. We can enhance direct investment in the indigenous-led conservation, reforestation, and agroforestry initiative in communal lands. And finally, drawing on the links between the destruction of nature and the COVID-19 pandemic, we can increase awareness of the need for nature conservation for our overall health. Hopefully, with this proposed solution, we can work together to help this community around the world overcome the challenges they face. All of us here today have the moral obligation of ensuring that the conservation work we do goes in line with protecting the rights of indigenous people. IUCN is now organizing a World Summit of Indigenous People and Nature, which will take place this September at the IUCN World Conservation Congress. This will be a key milestone in strengthening indigenous people rights. Thank you very much. You are muted, Marcela.
Really, thank you, Bruno Berle. It's been, thank you for your words, and this brings us to the end of the discussions that we have had today. I must say that they have been extremely profound and rich. We have brought together thinking around indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and people who have migrating groups. We have identified common threats, and there have been many identified today, but just let me mention that in spite of the great knowledge that they have developed, being repositories and developers of knowledge, that knowledge is not necessarily recognized, respected, or included in policy. There's also a common thread, that is that the rights are not respected, usually, and that they are disproportionately affected by poverty, by climate change itself, and also, for example, by the current pandemic. But we have also discussed many possible ways for the future. This discussion that has been opened today, I believe, is going to be very productive. We will take the different proposals that you have been made throughout the discussion, including, for example, creating the fund. We hope that is also something that can be done. But what is very clear, came out very clearly from all the different angles. Of course, we had a discussion that brought these populations together through the lens of climate change. But through the discussion, we discovered many other angles where we need to come together again to develop. But what was very evident throughout the different angles was of the importance of voice. Voice for indigenous peoples, voice for Afro-descendants, voice for migrating groups, for them to be heard, for them to be incorporated within policy, and for them to be respected. And this will definitely help in the climate crisis and will help to build a better planet for the future. So I'd like to thank very especially each and every one of the persons who took the floor, the persons who attended, the persons who were together with us, the persons who put their thoughts and made contacts and shared information through the chat. And also, I'd like to thank our interpreters who are also going over time. Thank you, every one of you, and thank you for contributing your perspectives, your points of view to making the world a better place. Thanks and goodbye.
Recording stopped.